Some people don't walk away because they never intended to stay. They stay just long enough to see how much you're willing to bend before you finally break. Welcome to Broken Truth, where love meets lies, and every story reveals the pain behind the smile. Some betrayals aren't sudden, they're slow. Intentional tests of your boundaries. Tiny moments where someone crosses a line just to see if you'll forgive it. It begins with overlooked sarcasm, ignored efforts, emotional distance, and when you don't push back, when you keep choosing love over pride, they take more. They betray not because you were unworthy, but because they were testing how little they could give and still be loved, when love becomes a game of endurance. Betrayal is the final move. They didn't leave in a storm. They left after slowly turning down the volume of who you were. Not once, but in patterns. They said things they didn't mean. Forgot things you never would. They laughed when you cried. And every time you forgave, they learned something dangerous, that you would rather hurt than lose them. So they tested. More, stayed out longer, answered colder, gave less, and you kept staying. Because when you love deeply, you think your patience will one day convince someone to be gentle. But what if their goal was never to stay? What if their goal was to keep pushing until you finally collapsed under the weight of everything they pretended not to see? Write this story in a minimum of 2,000 words. Follow the theme, reflect the hook, and use tone, style, mood. Sad, heavy, thoughtful. The story should be written in one go, not in parts, and should not include any titles or headings. Keep the flow seamless and uninterrupted. She didn't even notice it at first, the way her voice began to quiet around him. It wasn't silence, it was restraint. The kind of quiet you adopt when you're unsure if your truth is still welcome. At first, everything had felt like a dream. He listened. He smiled. He remembered small things. He held her hand like it meant something, like it tethered them to a shared world no one else could enter. She laughed too freely then, unaware that every piece of herself she gave would one day be weighed, tested, and ultimately used as evidence against her. But people don't break you all at once. They chip away gently. They learn your softness and use it as a map for where to press harder. The first time he mocked her vulnerability, it was cloaked in a joke. A harmless jab about how dramatic she could be. She laughed along, cheeks warm, unsure if it hurt or if she was just sensitive. He looked proud, not of her, but of how easily she swallowed it. She convinced herself love could be messy, that maybe being misunderstood was part of being known, that people say things they don't mean in moments of stress. So she explained herself calmly, explained the pain, the history, the sensitivity. She gave him a blueprint to her wounds, and he used it, not with cruelty, not openly. He just stopped showing up in the ways that mattered. Started forgetting dates, grew impatient when she asked for reassurance. He stopped saying goodnight first, stopped checking in when she went quiet, and when she asked why, he blamed her for needing too much, called her too emotional, too intense, too serious. She told herself this is what compromise looked like, that people love differently, that maybe she was the problem. So she adjusted, she smiled more, asked for less, took deep breaths when he was late and didn't respond, told herself not to spiral, told herself this is how love works. You wait, you forgive, you hold space, but he was not holding space for her. He was watching, measuring, testing. Every time she stayed silent after being hurt, he learned she could tolerate more. Every time she forgave without accountability, he understood she feared loss more than pain. Love became a scale tipped entirely in his favor. He gave what he wanted, when he wanted, and called it enough. She poured herself into the spaces he left hollow, filled the gaps with understanding. With softness, with reasons, she became fluent in the art of waiting for crumbs and calling them meals. And the worst part? He knew exactly how much she could take, so he gave just slightly less. It was never big betrayals, not at first. It was forgetting how she liked her coffee. It was saying, "You're overthinking," when she expressed concern. It was flirting with boundaries, not people, keeping his phone turned away, saying, "You don't trust me," instead of offering honesty. It was always just below the line of obvious wrong, and that's how you lose someone without ever leaving. She stayed because she believed love could be taught, that one day, if she just kept showing up, more patient, more kind, more forgiving, he'd finally understand how to love her the way she needed. But people like him don't stay to learn. They stay to see how much they can take without having to give. She started shrinking in rooms they once filled with laughter, censoring her feelings before they could be labeled too much, telling friends she was fine because explaining the pain felt like betrayal. She didn't want to make him look bad. She wanted to make it work, even when it was killing her. There was no final explosion, just a quiet evening, rain against the window. His absence heavy on the couch next to her. She stared at her phone. No texts, no calls. No, "I miss you." And suddenly, she didn't either, not because the pain stopped, but because it had become too familiar. So familiar, it began to feel like home. That terrified her, that her own breaking point wasn't a scream, but a sigh. A slow realization that she had been loving someone who only ever saw her as a mirror. A place to admire themselves, to feel powerful, to test the edges of their control. That night, she didn't cry. She sat with the echo of her own voice, the one she had silenced to keep the peace, and she heard it again. She heard herself say enough, not out loud, but inside. And somehow, that was louder than any goodbye. The next morning, she didn't text, didn't call, didn't ask where he'd been or why he didn't care. She didn't wait for him to leave. She left him from the inside first. Quietly, completely, finally, she didn't pack a bag. Just stopped offering explanations, stopped folding herself into what he would find acceptable, stopped breaking her own heart for the sake of one more chance. He noticed days later, when the space she used to fill with apologies stayed empty, when the silence wasn't followed by, "I'm sorry I overreacted," when his usual tactics didn't pull her back. He called, she answered, not out of hope, but closure. He asked why she was distant. She said, "Because I was loud for so long, and you never listened," and she meant it. Because love shouldn't be a test, it should be a choice. A consistent, clear, honest choice, and she was done being someone's endurance experiment. So she walked, not away from love, but toward it, toward the kind that doesn't measure how much you can take before you break, but the kind that honors you enough to never ask. She didn't wake up healed. That's not how it works. Healing isn't a clean break, it's a slow returning, and on most days, it felt more like learning how to live with the ache rather than forgetting it ever existed. But something shifted after she stopped waiting for answers. The silence that used to terrify her became something else, not punishment, not loneliness, but space. For the first time, space felt like safety. She wasn't rushing to fill it with noise or people or apologies. She let it stretch around her like a room she was finally allowed to breathe in. And in that space, she met herself again. At first, it was awkward, like speaking to someone you hadn't seen in years. She had forgotten what she loved when she wasn't managing someone else's moods. Forgotten what her own voice sounded like when it wasn't apologizing for taking up space. But she started with small things, waking up early, not because anyone needed her to, but because she liked the light that spilled into the kitchen when the world was still quiet. Making her coffee exactly how she liked it, strong, no sugar, a little cream, without anyone saying it was too bitter. Wearing clothes that felt like her, listening to old songs, rereading books she used to love before she was told they were too emotional. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about remembering that her softness was not a flaw. It was the part of her that kept showing up, even when others stopped. The part that stayed kind even when kindness wasn't returned. The part that had once confused endurance with love, but was now learning the difference because now she knew. Real love doesn't need to test you to believe in you. It doesn't need to see how much you'll tolerate before it decides to respect you. And more importantly, she didn't need to explain why she deserved respect. Not anymore. She had spent too long offering footnotes for her feelings, trying to convince people that her standards weren't demands, just the bare minimum. She had watered herself down to stay palatable, that now she was done making herself smaller so others could feel bigger. Her worth wasn't up for debate the next time someone crossed the line. She didn't stay to see if it would happen again. She didn't send long messages hoping to be understood. She just quietly left, not with anger, but with peace. Because healing didn't harden her, it taught her how to choose. She chose peace over closure, respect over attention, presence over promises. And when love did arrive again, slower this time, softer, she recognized it by what it didn't do. It didn't rush, it didn't test, it didn't shrink her voice or treat her kindness like a weakness. It met her where she stood, whole, unapologetic, clear, because now she loved from fullness, not fear. She loved with boundaries, not bargaining. And she loved herself, not in theory, but in practice. This time, she wasn't surviving love. She was living it, and finally, that was enough. Sometimes the people who test your limits are simply teaching you to rebuild stronger ones. If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe. This is Broken Truth, where silence is turned into understanding.